Hello, my dear viewers. I wish you pleasant viewing and a wonderful day. I also look forward to your feedback in the comments. I've always been a morning person, not out of joy, but necessity. The world is quieter before 8 a.m., and in that silence, systems whisper their secrets. It's when I do my best work. Code flows, architectures map themselves in my mind like veins in a leaf. But that morning, the one I'll never forget, the systems were silent. Too silent. And not just digitally. At 10:08 a.m., I was fired. Neatly, coldly, and in front of a room full of colleagues who suddenly found the patterns on the floor carpet very interesting. Let me back up. My name is Lisa Bobby, or at least that's what my mother named me. At work, I became Liza. The kind of name people mispronounce during meetings and never bother to correct. Liza. Liza with an S. Oh, sorry, did I get that wrong again? I stopped noticing after the first year. It was easier that way. Being invisible is a useful skill when you're building the skeleton of a billion-dollar system that nobody really understands, especially when your job is to make sure that system never breaks. I was the lead systems architect at Halcyon Dynamics. The title sounded impressive, but in reality, I was the fixer. The one who came in when a regional server cluster went haywire at 3 a.m., or when the sales team promised a feature that didn't exist and somehow needed to by Monday. I was the safety net that kept everything from collapsing. You'd think that would count for something. Apparently, it didn't. That morning, I arrived early for our weekly strategy sync. The meeting was supposed to be routine. A few updates, a few projections, and the usual jostling of egos around the glass boardroom table. I brought my tablet, a stylus, and my usual flask of black coffee. I even wore my navy blazer, the one I reserve for the days I know I'll need armor. When I walked into the conference room, something immediately felt off. There was an envelope on my chair. Not just any envelope. Thick, cream-colored, and unmarked, except for a small company seal embossed in the upper corner. The kind of envelope that screams finality. I froze. The others were chatting, scrolling through slides, avoiding eye contact with me, just enough to make the whole thing feel rehearsed. No one else had an envelope. My fingers closed around it slowly. I didn't open it right away. I sat down, placed it beside my tablet, and took a sip of coffee like nothing was wrong. Then Rose walked in. Ah, Rose Maddox, married into power, styled like a fashion spread from Forbes Women in Tech, and recently appointed as our head of strategic direction. A title that meant nothing and everything. She wore white that day, an icy, tailored pantsuit that almost matched the envelope. I remember thinking how intentional that looked. She smiled as she walked in, flanked by two executive aides who acted like this was just another product launch. "Lisa," she said smoothly, ignoring the rest of the team. "Please confirm you received your transition packet." My stomach clenched, but my voice was steady. "Of course." Rose nodded, turning her focus elsewhere. Already done with me. It was that simple. 7 years of architecture, audits, launches, nights spent on server floors, wrapped in data cables. Dismissed in a single corporate phrase. Transition packet. I opened the letter. My eyes scanned it quickly, even though I already knew what it would say. Effective immediately. Dissolution of position. Organizational restructuring. We appreciate your contributions. No reason. No offer of reallocation, just deletion. A red dot blinked on the top right corner of my tablet. A system update I had initiated 2 days ago was complete. The last one I would ever run under Halcyon's domain. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, and I smiled. I could feel the gazes of my teammates flick toward me and away again like nervous birds. Only one person held my eyes. Nate, back-end developer, and one of the few who knew what I'd actually built. His brow was creased with something close to concern, but even he didn't speak. "Your framework," Rose said without looking at me, "has been deemed obsolete. We're pivoting to a more agile model aligned with modern vision." My framework? Obsolete? She was talking about the modular command infrastructure I'd designed. the same framework that currently supported 76% of Halcyon's live integrations, including the one that had saved them from a $4.3 million data compliance penalty in Q1. But sure, let's call it obsolete. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I just nodded. I understand. Because I did understand. Far more than they realized. Here's what they didn't know. The architecture they just called obsolete? It wasn't just lines of code. It wasn't just endpoints and token verifications and load balancing maps. It was my language, my DNA. And like any good engineer raised on lessons of control, I had built in layers they never even noticed. They had the skeleton. I had the pulse. There was a component in the core logic, subtle, perfectly legal, that tied critical functions to an adaptive key index, a pattern only I could interpret. Not malicious, just personal, a fingerprint. If they pushed the wrong update or tried to integrate incompatible systems, it would begin to falter, not break, just hesitate, drop response time by a few milliseconds, then a few more, until every executive in that glass tower began to notice something was off and couldn't figure out why. It was invisible, but I wasn't. They thought this was the end of my story, that I would pack my things, cry into my ergonomic keyboard, and vanish quietly like so many others before me. What they didn't realize was that I hadn't just built a framework. I'd built a back door, a breadcrumb trail, a signature that only I could trace. And when their system inevitably hiccuped, when the logs started to flag anomalies deep in the infrastructure, and someone finally pulled up the failover script, they would see one name. My name. Liza Brown. Who is she? Oh, they'd find out. But not yet. I stood, folded the envelope, and slid it into my bag. Rose was already pivoting the conversation to Q3 projections, as if I had never existed. I left the boardroom with the same calm I'd used to build their empire. And I smiled, because control isn't just about power. It's about knowing exactly what they lost, and waiting for the moment when they finally realize it too. Hospitals always smell the same, sterile, sour, a strange blend of antiseptic and something else, something faintly metallic, like a warning. I remember thinking that, sitting by my mother's hospital bed, counting the beeps of the monitor, as if each one was another second I could steal back. She had always been strong, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, but lives in the way someone fixes a broken fuse or hauls groceries up 3 flights of stairs without complaint. A retired electrical engineer, she had built her way through every obstacle life handed her. When I was little, she soldered circuits at the kitchen table while I drew pictures of machines I couldn't name yet. When I was a teenager, she helped me take apart my first computer and put it back together better than before. Now she was dying, a small, still figure under a tangle of tubes and wires. But her eyes were as sharp as ever. I hadn't planned to show her the diagram. It was something I had sketched in the margins of my notes during a particularly mind-numbing systems meeting a few weeks earlier. Just lines and blocks at first. A theoretical framework for an adaptive infrastructure model, one that could route system loads dynamically based on real-time analytics and self-correct through predictive modeling. I didn't even think it was good yet, but I couldn't stop tinkering with it. Even as I sat by her bed for hours at a time, I kept refining it, adding new variables, rethinking the logic flow. It wasn't work. It was escape, a lifeboat I built while the shore burned. That afternoon, she was lucid. She'd been in and out for days, her voice reduced to a whisper. I was holding her hand with one and scribbling adjustments in the other, trying to keep my mind occupied. Then she did something unexpected. She pointed at the notebook in my lap. Let me see. I hesitated. It's just work. Don't worry about that now. She shook her head, slow but firm. I want to see. I handed her the notebook, open to the diagram. She looked at it for a long time. I could tell she understood it. Not just the shapes, but the vision. Her fingers traced a section of the flowchart, the corner I'd labeled Core Integrity Node. This is yours? I nodded. It's early, just an idea. She looked up at me, her face drawn with exhaustion, but suddenly filled with a strange kind of focus. "No," she said, "it's more than an idea. This matters." I didn't know what to say. I'd never thought of it that way. She reached toward the pen, resting on her tray table, the kind the nurses used for charts. Her hand trembled. I moved to stop her, thinking she was too weak, but she shook her head again. "You sign it," she whispered. "It begins with you." I paused. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? Signing a napkin sketch system design in a hospital room while my mother lay dying? But she was looking at me the same way she had the day I got accepted into MIT. The same way she'd looked when I took apart her coffee machine and rebuilt it to brew faster. And I realized this wasn't about the diagram. It was about claiming something, so I signed it. My full name, underlined. Liza Brown. She smiled. Her hand relaxed. She closed her eyes and didn't open them again for another 24 hours. That was the last time we really spoke. She passed away the next evening. Peacefully, the nurses said. I stayed with her until midnight, held her hand long after the machine stopped. I remember thinking that the silence felt wrong, not tragic, just too quiet, like the world had already moved on. The funeral was modest, no long-winded speeches, no grand send-off, just her colleagues, a few distant relatives, and me. I delivered the eulogy. I wore the blue scarf she had knitted during her chemo treatments. I made it through without crying, though my voice broke once when I said, "She built everything I ever knew how to fix." And the next morning, I went to work. People said I should have taken time off, grieved, traveled. But I didn't want distance. I wanted purpose. I wanted that diagram to mean something more than a moment in a hospital room. So I returned to Halcyon Dynamics with a fire burning inside me. I locked myself in the lab and began turning that sketch into a living, breathing architecture. One that could scale, one that could evolve, one that would become the foundation of Halcyon's global infrastructure, even if they never knew the story behind it. I worked like a machine. Weekends blurred into weeks. Holidays became deployment deadlines. I missed birthdays, skipped weddings, even worked through a New Year's Eve server crisis while the fireworks outside echoed like gunfire. And every time someone asked why, I told them the same thing. I believe in the mission. That was a lie. I believed in the sacrifice. I believed that if I gave enough, if I poured enough of myself into the bones of that system, it would protect me. That loyalty would be my armor. That the company would see me, value me, keep me. But this morning, Rose slid that letter into my hand without flinching. And all of it, the sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the funeral I barely allowed myself to grieve, was swept away with one word. Obsolete. I wasn't even worth a transition period. Not even a handover meeting. Just a severance packet and a vacant smile. They didn't know about the notebook. They didn't know about the hospital room. They didn't know the framework wasn't just code. It was a goodbye. A legacy wrapped in logic gates and data trees. A final gift from a woman who built things when no one believed she could. They erased my name from the system. But they can't erase the story, because every time that infrastructure routes a packet, or adapts a load, or recovers from failure, it does so with my signature embedded deep in the flow. Liza Brown. They never bothered to learn it. But one day, soon, they'll have no choice but to remember it. Rose Maddox wore authority like a designer coat. Expensive, pristine, and always just a little too much for the weather. Every time she clicked into a room on those absurdly perfect stilettos, silence followed like perfume. She had a presence, not the kind you earn, but the kind you inherit or marry into. I'll give her this. She looked like a leader. But Rose wasn't a leader. She was a manager with a Harvard diploma, a diamond the size of a peanut on her left hand, and absolutely no concept of what the blinking red light on a server rack meant. And still, they gave her the keys to the kingdom. Her job title was Head of Strategic Direction, a position that didn't exist until the board decided that Victor Maddox's new wife should have a seat at the table. And not just any seat, the kind that came with an expense account and executive override. Rose talked in metaphors. Everything was about synergy and brand experience. I once heard her say the word paradigm 3 times in a single sentence. She treated system architecture like a mood board, and engineers like temp workers in a coffee shop she didn't plan to revisit. She wasn't interested in how things worked, just in how they looked, and how much control she could have over them. I remember the day she pitched her most infamous idea. We were in the main conference room. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, casting a halo around her like it was her personal spotlight. She pulled up a slide deck titled Emotion-Responsive Operating Systems, The Future of Empathy in Tech. I wish I were making that up. We need to humanize the user experience, she said, stepping forward with the poise of someone who'd practiced the phrase 100 times in front of a mirror. What if the operating system felt with you? There was a long pause. Someone coughed. She took that as encouragement. Think about it, she continued, gesturing to a pastel diagram that looked like it had been pulled from a wellness startup. When a user is stressed, the system senses it, changes tone, adapts the color scheme, offers breathing exercises. Breathing exercises. For a logistics dashboard. I stole a glance at my colleagues. Mark, our security lead, was blinking like he'd forgotten how. Kevin, the UI dev, had turned slightly green. No one spoke, but Rose mistook our silence for awe. She turned to me. Lisa, don't you think that's powerful? A system that feels the user's needs? I opened my mouth, closed it, because if I said what I really thought, I'd be fired on the spot. Instead, I said, "What problem is this solving?" She frowned. "That's the old way of thinking," she said. "This isn't about fixing problems. It's about vision." And there it was. Her philosophy in one sentence. She didn't care about functionality, only fantasy, not structure, but spectacle. And spectacle needs a villain. That villain was us, the experienced engineers, analysts, and architects who asked annoying things like, what's the system load? Where's the data validation? Is there redundancy built in? She called us inflexible, set in our ways, resistant to innovation. But her version of innovation had no scaffolding. It was all ribbon and no foundation. And when she realized we wouldn't play along, she started replacing us. One by one, senior professionals were escorted out under the guise of restructuring. Entire departments collapsed into outsourced shells. Institutional knowledge disappeared in the span of weeks. What she didn't realize, what she still doesn't, is that knowledge isn't just in the code, it's in the hands that write it. The eyes that spot the anomaly before it becomes a breach. The instinct that knows when a data spike is a false positive and when it's a ticking bomb. You can't teach that in a 2-week onboarding. You can't download that from a Coursera course. And you definitely can't replace it with an empathy-inspired UI theme. When she handed me that envelope, cool, composed, surgically polite, I didn't just lose a job. I lost my system. She'd called it obsolete. She didn't even look at the framework logs before she decided to switch to a new, cloud-native visionary stack, built by a third-party consultancy that delivered more buzzwords than actual performance. I watched her onboard a new tech lead, a 20-something with more followers than GitHub commits, and gave him full access to the core. The moment she did that, I knew. It wasn't about skill. It was about ownership. She wanted to rebrand the system as her own, wanted to write over our blueprints with her pastel-colored vision and slap a logo on the infrastructure like it was a handbag. I watched her rename core functions in the control panel. I watched her strip away the safety triggers because they were cluttered. I watched her push for a design overhaul before validating the server compatibility. The logs are already spiking. Packet losses, latency errors, redundancies not triggering when they should. I can see it all from my admin shadow node, the one buried deep in the lower shell of the old dev network. The one no one knew existed. She thinks she controls the system now. She thinks she's won, but she doesn't understand the system. Not truly. She doesn't know that in real architecture, every choice leaves a fingerprint, every change reverberates. She doesn't know the framework was designed to resist misuse, that its logic flow adapts not to feelings, but to competence. Rose didn't fire an employee. She fired the last person who actually knew how to keep the machine breathing. And now she's steering a high-speed train with no brakes and a vanity license plate. The system is fraying, not because it's broken, but because it's being led by someone who never learned what any of the buttons do. She has control, but control without knowledge is just a countdown, and I'm the one holding the timer. Harold. That name doesn't ring a bell for anyone at Halcyon. Not in boardrooms, not in email chains, not in performance reviews. In fact, I'd bet half the executive suite couldn't tell you what my full name even was, despite the fact that my code still runs under their feet like oxygen through blood. But I never forgot it, not once. My mother was a herald, proud, precise, tireless. She used to say, "Build it like it's going to outlive you, and sign it like you want to be remembered." She meant it literally. The woman labeled every storage bin in the house, every drawer in her lab. Her name was always stamped on her workbench like a claim of legacy. It wasn't arrogance, it was insurance. That lesson stuck with me, especially when I joined Halcyon. They welcomed me like they welcome all technical hires. Quietly, with a stack of onboarding forms and a "Welcome to the family" Slack channel no one ever used. I was employee 187. No ribbon cutting, no grand announcement. Just a badge, a desk, and a system that desperately needed rebuilding. But before I ever signed their standard employment contract, I did one thing first. I filed 4 patents, filed them under my full legal name, Lisa Margaret Harold. Every major component I'd been prototyping, the adaptive routing logic, the fail-safe autobalancer, the telemetry stabilization sequence, and the behavioral mesh interface, all registered with the U.S. Patent Office under the Herald Systems Group. That wasn't some shell corporation. It was me, a single-member LLC I had quietly incorporated 6 months prior with the help of a freelance IP attorney I found on a tech law forum. I paid him in Bitcoin and coffee gift cards. He didn't know my real name. I used a clean alias. What mattered was the timestamp. The patents existed before Halcyon, and that, in legal terms, was everything. Most engineers don't think this way. We build things, we solve problems, we leave the paperwork to the suits. But I had grown up watching the suits erase people like my mother, people who worked twice as hard for half the credit. I wasn't about to let that happen to me, so I built something they couldn't erase. They didn't ask. Rose certainly didn't. She never inquired where the foundational code came from, never looked through the back-end repository history before gutting the original infrastructure. To her, the system was a tool, like a fancy app or a pair of earrings she could toss when a trend changed. She never noticed the license footer in the API key generator. She never hovered over the property line in the core index metadata. She never questioned the HSG Framework v1.0 notation buried 3 layers deep in the deployment config file. To her, it was just background noise. But that noise was binding, and now it was humming louder than ever. Rose had made changes. Big ones. She had approved updates that conflicted with the architecture's structural parameters. They'd forced compatibility with an external analytics vendor that injected foreign data logic into my behavioral mesh, a direct violation of Clause 6.1 in my licensing contract. Clause 6.1. Derivative alterations to Herald Systems Group intellectual property that result in system degradation or integrity compromise shall trigger immediate revocation of usage rights. In other words, break the system, lose the license. They broke it, and they don't even know it yet. I've seen the logs. Packet drops in their Western server cluster. Latency spikes in the real-time logistics layer. Fail-safe protocols failing to auto-deploy because their modern DevOps team stripped out the legacy support framework, the one that prevented cascading crashes. They think they're innovating, but all they're doing is peeling the paint off a dam. And the worst part? The clients are starting to notice. The first hint came from a Canadian pharmaceutical company, one of our biggest contracts. Their database backup job didn't fire at the scheduled interval, causing a minor delay in compliance verification. Harmless, but flagged. Then, a logistics firm in Munich reported data discrepancies during shipment tracking. And just yesterday, a South American energy client sent a curious request to my admin node, the one they weren't supposed to be able to find. A heartbeat signal, a whisper in the system. They're worried. And soon they'll come looking for answers. And when they do, they'll trace it all back. To Herald Systems Group, to me. They'll read the patent registry. They'll see the license clauses. They'll realize that the entire foundation of Halcyon's digital empire doesn't belong to Halcyon at all. It belongs to a woman they fired at 10:08 a.m. without a second thought. A woman who smiled as they handed her the envelope because she knew Rose wanted control. But she didn't do her due diligence. She didn't check the chain of ownership. She didn't think she had to. Because I was just Liza, right? Just the infrastructure girl. She never thought to ask what my real name was, never wondered who owned the signature under the code. But she's about to find out. And this time, she won't be able to fire her way out of it. I used to think that revenge would come with flames and thunder, that it would feel loud, powerful, maybe even satisfying. But when it arrived, it came quietly, as a subject line in my inbox. Licensing inquiry. HSG framework. I was wide awake when it came in. 12 a.m. The kind of hour when the world is silent, but your thoughts are screaming. I was sitting at my kitchen table, barefoot in leggings and a sweatshirt, nursing a mug of cold coffee and watching Halcyon's telemetry data spin in real time on my tablet. I hadn't been able to stop monitoring the system. It felt like watching someone drive your car into a wall. Slow motion, predictable, and absolutely horrifying. And then that email arrived. The sender wasn't immediately familiar. infosec@oberlintechglobal.com. But I knew the name. Of course I did. Oberlin Technologies. Halcyon's oldest, fiercest, most relentless rival. They were the only company that had ever come close to competing with our core infrastructure. And I say our, with the nostalgia of someone talking about a home that's already burned down. Oberlin had been trying to replicate Halcyon's performance metrics for years, investing millions in research, poaching developers, even launching surveillance-light products that sniffed for signature architecture traits, but they had never cracked it. And now, they had a different approach. I clicked the email. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't a threat. It was an offer. To Ms. Lisa M. Harold, we understand you may be the original inventor and registered patent holder of the HSG framework, as defined in USPTO filings 019-87219, 112,346, 12-1-7728, and URL 38093. We are prepared to offer a total sum of $750,000 USD for a full, exclusive, perpetual global license to this technology, contingent upon confirmation of valid ownership and revocation of Halcyon Dynamics' current usage rights. If these terms are agreeable, we request a preliminary call within 72 hours. Legal Division, Oberlin Technologies, Global, Confidential, and Time-Sensitive. I read the email 5 times before I moved. Then I stood, walked over to the window, and stared out at the city. The lights shimmered like static, neon blues and tired yellows blinking in foggy rhythm. Somewhere out there, Rose was probably sleeping like a queen, not knowing that the entire empire she thought she owned was about to be auctioned off. $750 million. It was the kind of number that didn't feel real, until I remembered that it was attached to something very real. My work, my name, my legacy. The implications landed slowly, like rain. They were offering me salvation, recognition, control, but only if I flipped the switch. Only if I revoked Halcyon's license and handed over the system they had built their future on. I pulled up the folder on my hard drive. HSG, Intellectual Patents. The digital certificate blinked at me. Lisa M. Harold. USPTO seal. Everything in perfect order. I had done it right. Filed before Halcyon. Registered separately. Structured the license as non-transferable, revocable, and compliant only under authorized derivative use. And now that Rose and her consulting crew had rewritten core functions, spliced in off-license code, and patched over the foundational logic, they had voided the compliance clause. They didn't even know it yet, but Halcyon was operating illegally on my framework. I could end them with a letter. But would I? I stared at the Oberlin message. My chest tightened. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about my mother, sitting by her hospital bed, signing that original diagram with her hand over mine. I was thinking about the years of sacrifice, the holidays missed, the nights I'd worked until sunrise because I believed in the system, in the mission, in the people. I was thinking about how none of them had called since I was fired. No one had asked how I was. Not even Nate. I walked back to my computer and pulled up a document I hadn't touched since the day I left. My resignation letter. I had written it weeks before they fired me. I'd never submitted it. Not because I didn't want to leave, but because I didn't want to leave bitter. I still believed there was something worth fighting for. But now I saw the truth with painful clarity. Halcyon Dynamics wasn't the company I had once built for. It wasn't a mission-driven tech lab or a sanctuary for invention. It was a PR machine, a boardroom theater, a glossy brand built on my silent labor. Rose had remade it in her image. Style over substance. A vision with no engineering soul. This wasn't betrayal. This was liberation. I pulled up the licensing dashboard. HSG Legal Management Suite. Still active. I clicked into the revocation panel. A warning popped up in red. This action will disable all active client usage of registered IP under license ID HSG A42. Proceed? My finger hovered. No one had ever said my name right. Not in meetings, not in emails, not even in the severance letter. But Oberlin did. Liza M. Harold. I wasn't some disposable cog. I was the architect, the one who built the bridge they all walked on, and the one who could burn it down if she chose. $750 million recognition, autonomy, my legacy, restored, on my terms. And as the sun began to rise over the edge of the city skyline, bathing the room in gold, I whispered something I hadn't said in a long time. I built it, and this time they would all remember. There's a difference between hope and insurance. Hope is what gets you through sleepless nights and silent meetings, believing your work will speak louder than politics. But insurance, that's what you build when you stop believing in fairy tales, when you know that eventually someone will try to take what you've created and pretend it was always theirs. That's why I wrote Clause 11.3. I didn't add it out of bitterness. Not back then. In fact, when I wrote it, I still believed in Halcyon Dynamics. I believed in its mission, its vision, its people. I thought we were building something meaningful together, something durable. But belief doesn't stop bad decisions or bad leaders. So I gave myself a failsafe. I found it again early that morning, after Oberlin's email had detonated my thoughts like a flash grenade. I had barely slept. My living room was lit only by the glow of my screen, and the silence around me felt too heavy to be peaceful. I dug into the depths of my original employment contract, not the glossy onboarding packet they hand you with your badge and mug, but the real one, the master agreement with all the legalese buried in the appendices. I had insisted on reviewing every line when I joined, insisted on writing some of them myself, and there it was, in a section most executives probably never even read. Clause 11.3. Sovereign authorship and control. No internal, external, or third-party entity shall alter, sublicense, revoke, transfer, decommission, or otherwise manipulate the core modules of the HSG framework, as defined in Appendices A through D, without the explicit written and biometric consent of the original architect, Liza M. Harold. This clause is perpetual and non-transferable, irrespective of employment status, corporate restructuring, or asset reclassification. All authorization requests must be executed through the HSG Authenticator subsystem with active biometric verification present within 2 meters at the time of execution. I exhaled, slow. They never saw it coming. Why would they? To the leadership at Halcyon, once they had my badge and W-2, they assumed they owned me, that they owned my code, my thinking, my hands, my time, and every bit of the system I gave them. They assumed everything belonged to the company, because that's what companies do, But that clause was a line they never crossed, because they never even looked for it. And I had made sure it wasn't just legal armor. I had embedded it in the architecture itself. It was my last line of defense, encrypted deep inside the framework's deployment pipeline. Hidden behind what looked like a standard authentication sequence was a biometric gatekeeper, a micro-protocol designed to detect the presence of a very specific subdermal frequency signature. Mine. It was a chip, implanted just under the skin of my left wrist. I'd had it inserted years ago as part of a brief experimental security project Halcyon quietly abandoned before Rose ever showed up. Most of the team forgot about it. I didn't. I tied it to the HSG Authenticator subsystem. Every major change to the framework, every deployment, every rollback, every patch to the root modules required proximity to my wrist. Without it, nothing moved. And guess what? They'd been trying to push major updates for the last 72 hours. I checked the logs on my private admin node, the node I never registered through the Halcyon network. It was still synced to the Gatekeeper protocol. Every unauthorized attempt showed up with the same flag. Operation blocked, clause 11.3, violation.biometric auth required. It had happened 6 times. 6 times they'd tried to overwrite what they didn't understand. 6 times they'd hit a wall, and every time, they probably blamed someone else. A junior dev, a configuration error, Jenkins. They'd try a different pipeline, a different deploy path, a different cloud bucket. But they'd all fail, because the system wasn't listening to them anymore. It was listening to me, even now, especially now. Systems built with care don't break easily. They don't cave under negligence. They resist, they defend, they remember. Just like I do. When I first built the framework, I coded in long hours in a basement lab with humming servers and terrible lighting. I had the sound of my mother's voice in my memory, urging me to protect what I built. If they want it, she'd said, make sure they ask. Clause 11.3 was me following her advice. It wasn't about ownership, it was about consent. They didn't have mine. And now, thanks to Rose's vision, Halcyon was operating on borrowed time. The executive suite didn't know it yet, but they were about to be pulled into a legal and technical firestorm. Their systems couldn't move forward without me. Oberlin's offer still hovered in my inbox, shining like a loaded gun with a velvet grip. $750 million, a chance to reclaim not just my work, but my identity. But Clause 11.3 meant I didn't even have to pull the trigger. I could hold the system hostage without ever writing a line of sabotage. The protection was already there. The best part? They couldn't even fire me again, because in the eyes of the system, I had never left. They'd cut off my badge, scrubbed my profile, deleted me from the team Slack. But the framework still asked for me. And no matter how many consultants Rose hired, or how many glossy slides she presented to the board, nothing would work until I came back and said one word. Yes. And that word wasn't coming. Not unless I decided it should. The streets were just beginning to warm when I stepped out of the cab at 9:56 a.m., the city air buzzing with that steady weekday hum. People on phones, feet against concrete, caffeine and ambition blending in the air like perfume. But I felt strangely calm, not triumphant, not angry, not even anxious, just quiet. I walked into the Oberlin Technologies building alone, no lawyer trailing behind me, no entourage, just a folder tucked under my arm and a faint ache behind my eyes from too many sleepless nights. The lobby was cold and clean, steel against glass, the logo embedded in marble behind the reception desk like a seal of judgment. The receptionist, a young man in a navy sweater, looked up and straightened the moment he saw me. "Ms. Harold?" I nodded. He clicked something on his tablet and gestured toward the elevators. "They're ready for you. Floor 27. The ride up was silent. No music, no muzak. Just the gentle whoosh of ascent and the sound of my own breath in the enclosed space. I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. Hair pulled back, eyes sharp. Older than when I started this journey, but clearer too. I hadn't come here to win. I'd come to remember myself. The doors opened with a soft chime, and a woman in a slate gray suit stood waiting. She didn't offer her name. She didn't need to. This wasn't a welcome party. She led me down a long hallway, past glass-walled conference rooms and pristine whiteboards that looked like they'd never been touched. A place of order, ambition, structure. They weren't like Halcyon, not the Halcyon I had left behind, bloated with ego and politics, run by people who thought power was louder than purpose. We stopped at a door labeled Executive Conference West. I stepped inside. There was no stage, no panel of watching eyes, just a long walnut table, 6 chairs, and a single envelope in the center, with a black pen laid perfectly across it. The room was empty, except for a man I recognized, Oberlin's general counsel. Polished, silver-templed, the kind of man who read footnotes for sport. He stood when I entered, but didn't reach for a handshake. He understood the moment. "You've reviewed the final terms?" he asked softly. I nodded. They were clear. He hesitated for a second. "There's still time, if you'd like your representation." "I don't need anyone else speaking for me." He nodded. No argument. He slid the envelope toward me. "You sign this, and the system becomes Oberlin property under a global license. Full attribution. Perpetual usage. Your name on every platform, every client, every innovation that grows from it." "I know." I opened the envelope, pulled out the contract. It was thick. Pages and pages of carefully constructed terms, indemnities, attributions, royalties. But I had read it all already, backward and forward, twice. And now, all that remained was the line at the bottom of the last page. Signature of patent holder. I picked up the pen. There was no hesitation in my hand. Lisa Margaret Harold. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But for the first time in years, I felt whole. I had taken back the system. Not through sabotage, not with noise, but through clarity. The man across the table took the paper, nodded once, and placed it in a sealed folder. He stood, gathering his briefcase. "That's it?" "That's it," I said. He looked at me. "No statements? No press? No cameras?" "No noise," I said. "Let the system speak for me." And it would. In every server it powered, every process it improved, every data stream that moved faster, cleaner, smarter than the competition. The signature I wrote today was more than legal. It was the beginning of something permanent. A reclamation. As I walked out, the receptionist looked up again, eyes wide. I gave him the faintest smile. Back on the street, the city hadn't changed. Still honking cars, still blinking crosswalks, still people rushing to meetings they thought would define them. But for me, everything was different. At 10:08 a.m., across town, Rose would receive a formal legal notice in her inbox. It would come with a quiet ding, like any other email. No fireworks, no headlines, just a document confirming the termination of Halcyon's license to the HSG framework. A line would be highlighted in bold. Effective immediately, all access, modification, and deployment rights are revoked. The message would be followed by a string of tech alerts and API failures. Their new builds would stop deploying, their dashboards would freeze, their clients would start calling, and somewhere, in some executive office, someone would say the name out loud for the first time in years. "Who the hell is Lisa Harold?" But they'd be too late, because I wasn't coming back. And this time, they couldn't rewrite the credits. They couldn't mute the voice behind the machine. I had built the system with care. And now, finally, I'd given it a future where the builder's name wasn't erased. Mine, Harold. It started like a whisper, not with an announcement, but with a disappearance. At exactly 11:58 a.m., without ceremony or notice, Halcyon Dynamics removed the centerpiece of their website. For nearly 3 years, the homepage had been dominated by a bold claim. Powered by the HSG framework, TM. Infrastructure reimagined. Gone. Just gone. There was no splashy campaign to replace it, no press release about an exciting pivot or upgrade. They didn't even pretend to explain it. They simply scrubbed it. The new headline read, "We're preparing for what's next." The irony nearly made me laugh, because what was next, for them, was collapse. I was sitting by the window when I noticed. It was cloudy outside, the kind of muted afternoon where everything feels paused. I had jasmine tea in hand, one sock on, my blanket pulled up to my ribs, and my laptop resting against my knees. I wasn't refreshing their website on purpose. Old habit, maybe. Muscle memory. The same instinct that had once had me checking server latency and ping response times before brushing my teeth. I clicked the site, intending to look at the investor portal. Just curiosity. And there it was. The banner, gone. The code, mine. Erased from the front page, but still humming underneath in panic. I leaned in. The API documentation was offline. The deployment notes had been pulled. Client portal, temporarily unavailable. What they didn't realize, or didn't want to admit, was that their panic had already leaked, not just into the tech, but into the world. By 1:15 p.m., the forums were buzzing, quiet corners of the internet, where engineers, CTOs, and cybersecurity freaks congregate to talk about anomalies in systems that aren't supposed to break. Someone posted a redacted screenshot, 12:03. Fatal. Framework override rejected. Biometric auth required. ZO3 Southert. Error code, clause 11. Triggered, 12:03:25. System locked. Unauthorized access attempt logged. Another reply below it read simply, "Who the hell is L. Harold?" I smiled softly. Let them ask. They were going to be asking for a while. The silence at Halcyon wasn't passive. It was strategy. The execs were trying to keep the blood off the floor long enough to calm their shareholders. But the internet doesn't wait. Within hours, tech blogs began publishing speculative headlines. Halcyon system disruption, internal error, or licensing catastrophe. Key infrastructure tools suddenly pulled. Sources point to intellectual property conflict. The missing woman behind Halcyon's collapse. Who is Lisa M. Harold? I didn't grant interviews, didn't post a statement, didn't change my LinkedIn. I didn't have to. The story was telling itself, through broken systems, failed dashboards, and frozen update queues. Through junior engineers refreshing Jenkins logs in a panic. Through PR officers emailing one another desperate lines like, "Do we have a non-compete clause on Harold?" The answer was no. They never thought I was a threat. They called me legacy. They called me overbuilt. They called me too protective of her modules. But now, my so-called rigidity was the only thing holding the bones of their system together, and it was cracking. I made myself a second cup of tea, stronger this time, added a splash of lemon. The messages had begun flooding in hours earlier. Emails, DMs, signal requests, even a voicemail from someone who once told me to let the more experienced folks lead the innovation roadmap. Funny how desperation makes people remember your number. Subject lines blinked across my screen like apologies dressed as questions. We just want to understand what happened. I know we didn't always agree, but I never doubted your brilliance. The way they treated you was wrong. Can we talk? Did you really do this alone? I don't know if you'll see this, but thank you. I read everyone, and I didn't reply, not out of malice, but because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a victory speech. And this wasn't a victory. It was a eulogy. I loved Halcyon once, fiercely, stupidly. I believed in it when it was little more than a few minds in a server room with bad lighting and coffee-stained diagrams. I worked through weekends, flew economy to conferences they sent others first class. I debugged mission-critical infrastructure while sitting in hospital waiting rooms. I stayed after my mother's funeral, because I thought loyalty would mean something, because I thought integrity would earn me a seat. But loyalty doesn't survive power shifts. And integrity? Integrity only threatens people who build nothing, so they erased me, until the system wouldn't let them. Somewhere deep inside Halcyon's backend, a failsafe was still ticking. A simple line of logic tied to my biometric chip. No flashy code, no booby traps, just a refusal to cooperate without consent. The system didn't need to crash to rebel. It only needed to stop responding. And that's exactly what it was doing. You can't edit what you don't own. You can't silence code that remembers its author. And now, for the first time in years, they were realizing I had never really left. The servers still whispered my name. The logs still knew my fingerprint. And the clients, the ones calling with urgent questions, watching their dashboards stall, wondering why no one could give them a straight answer. They were starting to ask the same thing. What happened to the woman who built all this? She's sitting on a couch, sipping tea, wrapped in a blanket stitched by her mother's hands. She's alive. She's quiet. And she is done explaining herself. The message came in the darkest hour of the night, the kind that presses down on your ribs and makes your thoughts feel louder than the wind. It was 3:04 a.m. I was curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't reading, the tea I'd made hours ago gone lukewarm, untouched beside me. The notification blinked on my laptop screen. Voice message from Emil D. Duration, 18 minutes, 27 seconds. Emil. I hadn't heard from him in over a year. Not since he left for Halcyon full-time. A brilliant intern once assigned to me for a single summer. Reserved, kind-eyed, someone who had studied not just what I taught, but how I carried myself when others didn't listen. He used to stay late to ask me questions about recursion and architecture principles, never pretending he knew more than he did. And now, apparently, he had sent me an audio file labeled Emergency Leadership Call, 21st July 2025, confidential. No subject, no explanation, just a single line in the message. They said your name, your real name. I thought you should hear it. My heart didn't race. It slowed. I plugged in my headphones, hit play, and leaned back, letting the darkness fill the room around me as the voices began. It wasn't a meeting, not in any traditional sense. It was chaos. You could hear the background noise first, the scuffle of chairs being dragged, phones buzzing unanswered, someone clicking keys so hard it sounded violent. Then came the voice I knew all too well. Rose, clipped, controlled, trying, desperately, to hold the tone of someone who wasn't losing everything. I want to understand what's happening. No PR fluff, no tech babble. What is the situation? Another voice, someone from legal, calm and precise. We've confirmed that all 4 of the HSG patents were registered under Lisa Margaret Harold, not under her employment contract name, but her legal name. Harold is her maiden name. A beat of silence. And? Rose snapped. And the patents include a biometric access clause tied to the author, Clause 11.3. It's binding, and it's active. We've been deploying against her framework in violation of that clause for at least 72 hours. Another voice cut in. Younger, male. Emil. His tone was cautious but factual. We thought the system errors were infrastructure bugs, but the logs are all clear. It's Clause 11.3 that's rejecting every deployment. Without Lisa's biometric signature, nothing gets approved. Not updates, not patches, not even a rollback. There was a sound then, like Rose had dropped something, maybe a pen, maybe her phone. Harold, she whispered. That's her name? That's who's doing this? Yes. No, that's not possible. We fired her. We cut her access. This isn't her company. She signed a waiver. She smiled when I handed her the envelope. Another silence, and then came the sound I didn't expect. Her breath hitching. Her voice dropped an octave, suddenly brittle. She smiled because she knew. She knew this would happen. And none of you checked the filings? Legal again, uncomfortably steady. You told us she was legacy staff. We didn't question that. Legacy staff don't own the patents. Legacy staff don't build the spine of our systems and hide locks inside them. Do you understand what this means? Without her consent, we're operating illegally. We've lost everything. Someone else spoke then. An engineer, maybe a contractor. They mumbled something about contacting Lisa. Rose cut them off instantly. She's not coming back. She signed with Oberlin. We lost her, and we didn't even know her real name." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was empty, heavy, like the weight of a name no one respected until it became essential. I paused the audio, sat back, let the stillness stretch long across the room. Then I hit play again. The panic was mounting in their voices now. Talk of investor relations, of clients noticing delays, of infrastructure partners quietly walking away. There was the sound of someone pacing, breathing fast, typing as if urgency could outrun the truth. But the truth had already arrived, and it wore my name. I let the last 2 minutes play out like a coda. Rose's voice had changed, no longer commanding, no longer sharp. She sounded small. She didn't fight back. She didn't threaten us. She didn't demand anything. She just walked away. Why? Why didn't she burn the place down if she could? Someone offered an answer, their voice a whisper in the din. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe walking away was the answer. And then the recording ended. I sat in the silence afterward, headphones in, laptop screen dark. The tea had long since gone cold beside me, and still I didn't move, because for the first time in a very long time, I felt it. Not the urge to explain, to defend, to prove, just peace. The kind you earn after walking through fire without becoming it. The kind that finds you not when you win, but when you no longer need to. They had erased my name from every hallway, every meeting, every glossy PDF, but now it was the only name echoing through their panic. Harold, the signature they overlooked. The woman they never saw coming. The architect they tried to forget, and who now lived in every line of code they could no longer touch. The sky above the convention center was bright and clean, the kind of blue you almost don't believe until you step into it. I hadn't been back to a tech conference in over 4 years. The last one I attended, I was a silent observer, squeezed into a second-row chair, while some newly minted VP mispronounced my name during a presentation about a system I had built with my own hands. This time was different. I wasn't walking in behind anyone. I wasn't there to support, or to shadow, or to fact-check someone else's pitch deck. This time, I walked in through the main entrance, and my name was on the banner. Liza M. Harold, keynote guest. There was no title next to it. No consultant. No former engineer. No watered-down adjective to make me palatable. Just the truth. Just me. The conference was hosted by Oberlin Technologies, their first in-person innovation summit since acquiring the license to the HSG framework. The event was buzzing with anticipation. Everyone in the industry had seen what happened to Halcyon, but no one had seen the woman behind the system since, until now. Inside the venue, soft acoustic music played over speakers. Rows of exhibits glowed with subtle light. Engineers walked past with notebooks. Young developers leaned in to watch demo screens. Founders swapped lanyards like trading cards. I kept to the edges until they called me to the stage. I didn't need a spotlight. I didn't need an introduction full of superlatives. But when they read my name aloud to the auditorium, "Please welcome to the stage the architect of the HSG framework, Liza M. Harold," something shifted in the room. The applause wasn't wild or theatrical. It was reverent, quiet, intentional, like every clap carried a sentence unsaid. When I stepped onto the stage, I saw them. Engineers I had mentored. Developers who once sat across from me in windowless labs, frustrated by syntax errors and deployment logs. They were here now, beside me, not beneath me. I took my seat, flanked by 3 of them, former interns, now leaders in their own right. They smiled at me as equals, not as survivors of a system, but as co-authors of what came next. The talk wasn't dramatic. I didn't rehash the past. I didn't weaponize my wounds. I spoke about design, about what it means to build something that can outlast the people who betray it. I spoke about integrity in architecture, about embedding values in code, about how resilience isn't just about uptime. It's about memory, systems that remember the people who built them and the principles that shaped them. I spoke about my mother, how I signed the first diagram next to her hospital bed, how she made me promise, in a voice barely audible through the morphine, that if I ever gave the world something meaningful, I would not let them take it without asking. I made that promise. Clause 11.3 was how I kept it. Afterward, there were handshakes, quiet words, a few thank yous. Then I stepped down from the stage and made my way toward the exit, needing air more than attention. That's when she found me. Young, early 20s maybe. Press badge around her neck, notebook in one hand, hair pulled into a messy braid. Her name tag read, Maya Reyes, Tech Now Weekly. She approached me slowly, like someone stepping onto sacred ground. "Ms. Harold?" she asked, tentative. I smiled gently. "Yes?" She shifted her weight, nervous. "I'm sorry, I needed to say something. I've been researching your story. The Halcyon documents, the patents, the framework design logs, Clause 11.3, all of it. I've spent weeks reading everything I could." I waited. Her voice caught for a moment. Then, "They always talked about you, like you were a consultant, a support voice, a team contributor. But after everything I've read, everything I've seen, I get it now." She swallowed. "You weren't a contributor. You weren't the support system. You were the system." And there it was. Not shouted. Not published on a headline. Spoken. Simply, truly. For a moment, I felt the weight of it. Not as burden, but as balm. The name they had buried had become a foundation. My silence, once mistaken for compliance, was now understood for what it really was. Choice. I nodded. "Thank you, Maya." She didn't ask for a quote or a selfie. She just smiled, that deep, quiet smile of someone who's seen behind the curtain, and walked away. I left the venue a little while later. Outside, the breeze was warm, the sky still impossibly blue. I passed people on their phones, laughing, trading notes about talks they'd attended. No one stopped me. And that felt right, because I didn't need to be a spectacle. I had become something more powerful. My name, the one they had forgotten, overwritten, mispronounced, erased, had become a symbol, not just of the system I built, but of how it survived. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was peace, and it was earned. I took a deep breath, stepped into the sun, and kept walking. No spotlight behind me, no echo of applause, just the sound of my own name, steady in my chest. Harold, a name they could no longer ignore, a name that would never again be erased. It was nearly autumn when I found out. The air had changed, crisper around the edges, the sun dipping sooner than it used to. I had started taking long walks again, slow ones, no destination, just silence and shoes on concrete, breathing in the quiet that used to feel like absence, but now felt like peace. I didn't go looking for it. The update found me. An article, buried between headlines about new tech IPOs and another rushed AI launch. Ex-Halcyon execs fall from grace. Why no one will hire Rose Stravara. I clicked on it with no expectation. Not out of vindictiveness, but curiosity, like thumbing a bruise you forgot you had. It was a surprisingly restrained piece. No tabloid slander. Just facts. She'd resigned voluntarily 6 weeks after the HSG licensing scandal hit the news cycle, after investor confidence plummeted, and 3 major clients sued for breach of service. She had tried briefly to pivot into consulting, 2 keynote requests, 1 panel discussion that was mysteriously canceled the day before. Then silence. Executives who once praised her as dynamic and a bold new voice in infrastructure innovation were no longer returning her calls. One recruiter, unnamed, had reportedly said off-record, "She burned too hot, too fast, too shallow." Another line lingered in my mind. Without the framework behind her, there was nothing left to stand on. They never said my name. They didn't have to. I closed the tab, let the screen fade to black, and I just sat there, tea cooling in my hands, cat snoring softly on the edge of the windowsill. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in seeing her fail. What I felt was simpler. Recognition. Because the truth was, Rose had never really seen the system. She had seen the spotlight, the influence, the chance to sit in rooms and make pronouncements that sounded visionary to the untrained ear. But systems, real ones, don't run on spotlight. They run on precision, care, humility, the kind of work done in silence, long before the launch party. That was the difference. Rose wanted control. I wanted continuity. And now, control had abandoned her. I took another sip of tea and turned back to the window, watching a leaf drift down from a tree across the street. It landed gently on the hood of a parked car, unnoticed by the world, but still there, still intact. People had asked if I felt justice was done, but justice was never the goal. Peace was, and I had it. Rose had power once, but I had something she never thought to want, a name that stayed, and that would always be enough.